Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Library, and the Avon Senior Center, and the Planning Committee for Unearthing History, I welcome you to an unprecedented fourth year of educational and informative events, mostly covering the Paleo people, Indian land, and animals of the 12,500 years ago in this region. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, welcome. For those who have been with us along this journey, we welcome you back. We're happy again to be joined by our partners, the Avon Land Trust, the Farmington River Watershed Association, and the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. We're pleased to be a third-year recipient of a grant from the Lower Farmington River and Salmon Brook Wild and Scenic Committee so that we can bring you another 5 presentations. Their funding comes from the National Park Service, which recognizes the importance of continuing education of all river matters in this country. The origin of this webinar series is the discovery in 2019 of the Brian D. Jones Paleo Indian site along the Farmington River here in Connecticut, and the first public presentation of the site in February of 2020, which began a deep exploration by us into this incredible time in our world's history. To learn more, please visit the Avon Historical Society's website and drop down the page for the Brian D. Jones Paleo Indian site. Since we began this Unearthing History webinar series in 2021, finding subject matter experts was almost too easy. The topic of early peopling of North America abounds with anthropologists, scientists, archaeologists, paleontologists, and sociologists. And the discovery in Avon opened up the door to so many topics that when asked, every speaker very quickly and with much enthusiasm said yes. And tonight is no exception. It occurred to us that right here in Connecticut, we have a former state archaeologist who has decades of experience in Native American archaeology that we would be remiss if we didn't ask him to share his knowledge. And like we said at the beginning, he's a fan favorite of our history audience. Many of you know Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, the emeritus state Connecticut archaeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History and the adjunct associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut. His resume is too long to read, and his list of publications in books is also. So I suggest you go to the UCONN website and read his CV. But to many of us, he is the skeleton guy who shows up at the oddest sites in our state to identify the how and why a person died. But what's more fun or gruesome, depending on how you look at it, is his way of connecting the dots in history that may or may not explain how a person died, when, and where. His 40 years of excavating the soil of Connecticut, whether it's Native American site or a more recent shallow grave, Nick can be found knee-deep in science and history. And for all those reasons, we welcome here tonight to take us on a tour of Native American archaeology in Connecticut. So welcome, Nick. The webinar is yours.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you everybody for tuning in. And listen, I have to tell you that it's an honor to be a part of this webinar. I've talked with other archaeologists in the state, and they have told me they are so impressed with this because what it has also done for us at our end is create a real awareness among the public of the importance of archaeology and what we do in terms of understanding the past. So we congratulate everyone involved in this, and we're just thrilled to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen with you and start a slideshow that hopefully you'll be able to. All right. I think we could, there we go. And I kind of, first of all, to start, I'm calling this kind of the history of Native American archaeology in the state. And, that kind of sounds like I'm going to talk about the archaeologists, that the history of their work. And while we may do that at another time, because it is a fascinating story about the history of Connecticut archaeology, what I really intend to do is to give you that timeline, if you will, the chronology, starting with the Brian D. Jones site at 12,500 years ago, and kind of give you an overview of what happens between that time, the first peopling of the state of Connecticut and the Avon area, obviously, and right up into historic times. So what I'm going to do is cover 12,000 years for you. And that's kind of a hard thing to do in an hour. because there's so much to tell and there's so much history. So what I'm going to have to do is keep it, to bare bones, unfortunately, but I hopefully give you appreciation of social organizations, changes that occur, but also how it's all steeped in the science of archaeology, to get in the ground, dig it out, dirt archaeology that allows us to recover artifacts, ecofacts, different kind of remnants of our past and the past of others, in a controlled way that allows us to understand associations horizontally, as you see this young man excavating the soil in the ground, and vertically as we get deeper into the ground to tell the story through archaeology of people in the past. Just to understand that archaeologists use a scientific method when we study the past, and we all are trained as anthropologists. That is to say, we're really interested in human behavior in the past. And while we, excavate stone tools and clay pottery fragments and so forth, and kind of sometimes the emphasis gets on what we recover, especially in museum displays and so forth. But what we're really interested in is understanding human behavior. What was life like back then? And how did they adapt to it? How did they organize themselves politically, religiously, economically? What can we tell about the people themselves? So we never want to lose that. We may be dealing with hard artifacts, but ultimately our goals are to understand human behavior, who people are, and how they lived. So in my model here for understanding the past cultural systems, we in Connecticut, we have three different models. We have one you're most familiar with, history, written documents, maps, and the ethnohistory of the first European settlers here in the 17th century that wrote about Native Americans and life here in Connecticut. But we also have another technique to get to, and that is through oral tradition of Native peoples themselves who have passed on some of the ideas and mores and values and belief systems of their past. And so we use that to help us learn that. And then finally, we have anthropological archaeology, where history deals with words and written documents, oral tradition with oral documentation. Archaeologists deal with material culture, artifacts, stuff that people have left in the ground that can be recovered and analyzed and understood in terms of their past. So because I am an archaeologist, that's what we're going to concentrate on most in what we present today. But we will all make mention of ethnohistoric records, and we will make mention of oral tradition. So note that archaeology is no stranger here. We have over 7,000 archaeological sites documented in the state of Connecticut with the Office of State Archaeology. And everywhere people have, from the first peopling 12,500 years ago, right up into this century as part of the archaeological record. In fact, the state of Connecticut gives the state archaeologist authority to excavate or to document sites that are 50 years old or more, which means I could be put on the National Register of Historic Places myself. But it's a rich and diverse record from the ground of the human past. When we talk about Native American archaeology, we talk about a regional chronology that includes the Paleo Indian period. And those of you that have been a part of following this webinar know about that period very strongly. It is the first peopling of the state. But archaeologists, like most of us in our culture, we love to work in three. So we talk about the Paleo Indian period, the Archaic period, which is a long stretch of almost 6,000 or more years, kind of a terminal Archaic period, and a Woodland period that we define again into early, middle, and late. We're going to go through these, try to show some of the highlights. Again, it's a very complex story, and to tell it in an hour is, my vocal cords wouldn't be able to make it through. So we start with the Ice Age, of course, because you know that a period of time called the Pleistocene, a geological period that really lasted for 2 to 3 million years, covered Avon and all of Connecticut at times in literally a mountain of ice. But when the ice, as it receded and advanced and so forth, it opened up areas of huge species development. And we would have seen that here in North America too. And what I like to be able to mention too, and if you already probably have learned, is that the ice is active. The glacier is active. It's moving, it's receding, it's taking with it soils and eroding the surfaces and taking boulders, if you will, of rock, stone the size of houses and moving them hundreds of miles away. So it's an active process. And the last glaciation is the Wisconsin glaciation, which started about 125,000 years ago. It reached its peak 18,000 years ago. And at that time would have covered all of Connecticut. If you use my cursor here, if you could follow it, you could see the terminus of the Wisconsin glaciation. And of course, Connecticut sitting here is completely covered. In Avon, 18,000 years ago, you would have been covered by clearly a mile-high mountain of ice that redistributed and scorched through the land, if you will. When we look at Connecticut at that time with the receding glaciation, Connecticut's ice-free about 15,000 years ago. And the Connecticut Valley, what we know today as the Connecticut River Valley, was really a glacial lake Hitchcock. Avon, you know, you guys got kind of all that lakeish through the Farmington area, but Talcott Mountain kind of saved you mostly from the lake waters of Hitchcock itself. But you could see there was Glacial Lake Albany, Glacial Lake, the Champlain Sea, which today is Champlain Lake and still there. And down here, what you call Long Island back then, we referred to as Glacial Lake, Connecticut. So again, this was a whole different environment. If you lived in Hartford 14,000 years ago, you'd been underwater. And this is an important part of our story because as the glaciers continued to melt, not only did they fill interior lakes, but they raised the sea level of the ocean, much like, you know, climate change is doing today with the warming conditions. The glaciers are continuing to melt at a greater rate in the last few decades. And as a result, we're seeing and threatened by sea level. But when all that massive ice went into the water now, we see, follow my cursor again, a real rise, a steady rise in the sea level until it stables off about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, which is an important part of our story because that's when our coastline stabilizes. So if you look at that Wisconsin refugia, here you got Glacial Lake, Connecticut, which would have been, we call Long Island Sound. You could have walked, here's the coastline out by the continental shelf through there. You know, you would have walked to Long Island and Block Island and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. They would have been nothing but hilltops in a vast coastal plain. But as this melting glacier started to, watch my cursor, with the rising sea levels, push back into the continent until it bangs against a hill called Long Island, inundates in its eastern part, and that glacial lake now becomes brackish, it becomes sea, it becomes a sound that you and I are in. So I tell you this because when we look for Paleo Indian sites, that earliest peopling, well, they may be submerged. They may be underwater today that we cannot or have difficulty getting to. And so my example of that is Hammonasset State Park. If those of you that are my age will remember in 1955, a tremendous storm system hit the state of Connecticut. And when it did, it flooded down our rivers, the Farmington River. Those of you in Avon at that time would have been flooded out from the storm, as well as, the town of Farmington and others, especially Unionville, Winston, and so forth. So with that storm, the beach at Hammonasset State Park got destroyed. And so in order to restore the beach, follow my cursor again, the state of Connecticut went out here into the water and started to dredge up sand to reconstruct the beach. Well, when they did, they hit a Native American site. And some of the artifacts that were turned over actually date 10,000 years ago, to the Paleo Indian period. So our abilities to find these sites are very difficult. And you know from the Brian Jones site that it is also in interior sites under, you know, many feet of soil that has developed over the area. So the Ice Age, we say, ends around 12,000 years ago, and it develops into what we call the Holocene period that we are in today. There's been a recent effort to try to name our current time the Anthropocene, that is the human scene, if you will, of geological time. And that may happen at some point, but not right now. But this is important because this is when the first people enter Connecticut, enter into New England. And it was an area where there were, post-Pleistocene mammals, large animals like mastodons and so forth, giant beaver, wolves, large animals that were now coming into the area, following grasses and so forth that were starting to develop here. But there was also smaller game also as well as fish and so forth. So after the deglaciation, the first humans come here. I mean, our radiocarbon date of 12,500 years ago at the Brian D. Jones site is the earliest one we have in Connecticut. These were small nomadic groups. The sites we find are along major and secondary river valleys along the coast. They're formed around glacial lake basins. And so what we think there's probably going on is that they're following herds of caribou or reindeer that would be migrating through Connecticut, or other kind of animals of that time. So we see them kind of challenging, but moving, and they're moving good distances too in search of herds and what have you. So the environment here is, kind of barren landscape after deglaciation. It would be filled in with pollen and seeds coming in, and a tundra sparse tundra environment, tree environment, I wanted to say. And gradually filled in with plants and animals. It was a colder climate, sea levels were lower, it was much more variable than what we see today. So the big question always is did people actually hunt these mastodons and mammoths? And possibly so. What we're learning from the Brian D. Jones sites is that there are blood residues that might be indicative of these mastodons and other large carriers. And the thing that's so important about the Brian D. Jones site that many of you already know is that it is so well excavated and it's such a wonderful preservation story that it also allows for understanding activity areas, discrete areas within the site in which different kind of activities are located. And what this does is it gives us not only the radiocarbon we get from charcoal pits, and the tools that help us understand these activity areas. But what they do is give us an idea of the people themselves and how they're organized spatially within the site. And I tend to sometimes think that because of the massive, I suppose the romance of the mastodons and so forth, that hunting is overestimated. These were flexible generalists. They were going to get what they could with an environment that did not have a lot of biodiversity in it. So they were opportunistic hunters, gatherers, fishermen. We don't know much about shelters. Don't have much post moles that I'll talk about later. We don't have burials, and we know a little bit more about plants and animals, but certainly the toolkit. But I don't want you to lose track of our goals, and our goals are the people themselves. Okay, that these were families, that they were moving. Trying to raise their kids in a way with traditions that they understood, and with an economic means of providing for them as they moved along the landscape. Don't lose this scene, because this is what's really important. Not the stone tools, not the fluted points, all pretty interesting and glamorous, but those tools, the fluted points and so forth, is how we get to the people, to an understanding. So when we look at that time period, we have few archaeological sites, which makes the Brian D. Jones site so significant to us. And we mostly have stone tools that we recover because that's what survives in the soil. And could many of these sites be submerged? And that's for sure, no doubt about it. You know, but the important thing about fluted points is we never see them in any other time period. 90% of the tools recovered, the stone recovered, are fluted points, but we also get side scrapers, end scrapers, drills, and engravers that help us understand that. The other important site of this time period is the Templeton site that was excavated by Roger Moeller in today's Institute of American Indian Studies way back in the 70s. And also re-excavated by Zachary Singer, his excavations through UCONN, starting in 2016 and so forth. And, you know, we're able to map out production areas, which is really kind of cool because, you know, it allows us to understand how not only these tools were made, but how they were used. And so look at this. You know, follow my cursor again. See the topsoil here? Look how deeply stratified these sites are, much like the Brian D. Jones sites. And look at the spatial coordinations of these stones that we find. There's a fluted point that are marked. And what many of these are coming from, you know, the stone itself are coming from great distances. You know, the church are from Albany, near Albany, New York area. The Jaspers are in eastern Pennsylvania and other areas. So that these are very important in what they tell us, not only about the tools themselves, but where the tools come from and where the people may have migrated in from or traded with other groups from. So it becomes these stone tools, when put together in context, help us to understand a great deal of what's going on there. That Paleo period ends around, you know, 10,000 years ago, because now once we get into that Holocene period, we get a warmer condition coming in. And with the warmer conditions, we now start getting a mixed deciduous forest, you know, first with pine and conifers, but then also with the deciduous plants, oak, hickory, and with it, birds and, you know, turkeys and people of the forest, animals and plants of the forest, I should say, that you and I are probably more familiar with today. And now Native Americans are adapting to these resources in a different way. So the environment's changed, and with it, tremendous biodiversity. And we call this the Archaic period now because there's a change in stone tools, there's a change in ways of life, there's a change in social organization. It's a long-lived period, you know, from 9,000 to 3,000 years ago. People were semi-nomadic. They were foragers moving around seasonally within kind of defined territories in some ways, or at least in a broad range that would give them the resources they needed to make a living for their families within a certain context. And their stone tools are now more locally defined, like quartz and quartzite. We're still getting some influence from, you know, cherts and jaspers and other materials from distant places, but mostly now it's local. People are staying in the area. They may not be moving far. But what we see through this time period are population increases. We see our first evidences of burial and ritual and ceremonial practices. And we see a diversity of habitation sites we may not have seen earlier. So what happens now is this regional settlement subsistence system or strategy that's taking advantage of a new biodiversity of plant and animal species within a foraging economy. So people are moving around to spring camps to fish and gather when anadromous fish are coming through, summer camps for shell fishing and using coastal plant resources, hunting in the fall where the mast is now gathering with oak and hickory nuts, and in the winter probably the hardest time in terms of hunting and very limited plant exploitation. But what this is life on the move. It's seasonally hunting and gathering camps, moving around where nature provided the resources. But what I want to emphasize to you in terms of this foraging economy is that this is not passive. This requires a sustainable land management practice that Native peoples utilized and developed for thousands of years. We find that wetlands were being weeded to encourage growth of certain species of plants, and that there's a selective harvesting of those plants. They actually, some seeds and weeds and become larger through time because of these management practices. And also, Native Americans used fire as a tool. They burned the underbrush, they burned the woodland. Those of you like myself who like to go out hiking through Connecticut's woodland and so forth, that underbrush sometimes is so thick, it takes away from our ability to move off a path or so forth. They recognize that, and they burn that underbrush to keep it as clear as possible. It not only provided for ease of travel and certainly hunting through a forested environment, but it created habitat that is favorable to turkey and deer and other animals, that forest edge. So it's not just simply a matter of, being able to travel through it. They recognized that they were creating habitat that were favorable to certain animals that they might want to exploit. Not passive at all, even in terms of their culture. Their houses were built that they could erect in a very few hours in a new place. Their material culture was easy to transport and recreate where they went. Think about all the stuff we have because we are sedentary in one house, and we create with our economy, and our industrial technology stuff. It's not easy for us to move, even with, huge trucks to help us move this stuff. They minimize that difficulty by keeping their material culture easy to transport. And their language, as their language developed through, it was precise about place and direction. We even use native place names today. Places like Connecticut is an Indian word for Long Tidal River. It gives precision about place and direction where they need to go. It's a very complex language, but it helps them understand their environment as they share it with others. So the point I'm making here is that, when we look at this technologically, this technology of bone, stone, and wood, it's not rockets that go to the moon in intensive industrialization. And some people may look down upon this as, being, the terms have been used in the past, primitive. But it's not primitive at all. It's very complex. And it takes an understanding and a knowledge of the world around them in order to adapt to it. And not only to adapt to it, but to sustain it in terms of land use practices. We're having a hard time in industrial technology sustaining our environments and our food practices because of the difficulties of what we have to deal with. They were doing the same thing, but they were solving those problems in different ways. So when we talk about, the sea level rises and stability, the creation of coastal habitats now become very important to the story of adaptation and foraging economies, because, with the stability of the sea level rises, we start seeing in the archaeological record 4,000 or so years ago the development of shell middens, because oysters and and clams, quahogs, and scallops are now available in greater quantities and numbers because of the diversity of those populations can rise now. Those animal populations can rise because of the stability, and same with the resources of the salt marsh and so forth. So it's a complex environment that develops here. In the latter part of this archaic system, archaic period, we see a kind of a fluorescence, a real seasonal pattern of exploitation. Things become what we call full blown because adaptation is so well inclined, and species of animals, the flora and fauna, are really getting to be very, very productive. And we also see, as I mentioned, with that stabilization, a strong maritime orientation, but they're adapting to mass forests. And what we see is an increase in the number of archaeological sites of this time period. And what we see is a diversity of these sites. So, before, we sometimes see these small camps moving around in this, this subsistence settlement system. Now we start seeing base camps, larger camps that are aggregations where people are coming together to share information. I'm sure to, socially, for marriage purposes, trading purposes, and so forth. So we see increased number of sites. The sites we see increase in size, and these are both indicators of increase in population. It's getting pretty crowded here. The populations are starting to rise in Connecticut at about this time. And what we also see is a social organization that's complex. There are more exotic lithics, that is, stones that are coming in, that trade networks are now being well defined. Trading networks that go to the interior of the continent, but trading networks also along the maritime and the mid-Atlantic areas. It's still a foraging economy, but there's a greater use of natural wild resources and the managing of those resources. We think we see in these new sites extended families, and certainly now more of a defining of territories, if you will, that are using rivers and stream valleys as boundaries. And this leads us to the terminal or the end of the Archaic, which now may have more than one population here. There is a tradition that comes in, we call archaeologically this Susquehanna. And this has evidence of ceremonialism, heightened ceremonialism and mortuary practices, large cremation burial complexes now at this time. And we also see the use of steatite or soapstone in the use of bowls that are used in regional exchange networks. And people are becoming more sedentary within their territories. This is what the stone bowls look like. They're carved out of steatite, which is a soft stone and can allow for the shaping. But we find Connecticut quarries of soapstone in other places in the mid-Atlantic states, in the interior. In other words, they're being traded. This is not just a utilitarian item for cooking, for example, but it's being used as more of a cultural complex of a stratified social system. It's heightened ceremonialism and trading. It's the one thing we can give. We have a band of steatite, natural steatite, that comes through Connecticut. Actually, it comes from veins, if you will, that are in central Massachusetts, comes down through Connecticut, through Somers, through Barkhamsted, not too far from Avon, Barkhamsted, Harwinton, Bristol, and in every one of those towns, there are quarries that Native American used at this time period. And some of these stone bowls, we find holes in them, deliberate breaking in some cases, maybe a spiritual releasing of the soul. But things are getting complex here, and they're getting complex socially too. There's probably an economic surplus with more food, and now an accumulation of wealth, which may or may not lead to some kind of stratification of social organization. Steatite bowls may become a factor of that. Quarried here in Connecticut, but found elsewhere in the continent. So things are getting complex here at that time. And it looks like we have two different traditions at the same time. What we call the Susquehanna or the broad spears. This appears to be stone tools that are coming in, and maybe a people that are coming in who are influenced from the south and the west. And yet we still have here a narrow stem point tradition, which we think might be a continuation of late archaic styles. So we may have two people coming together here, living on the landscape. Were they peaceful? Was it a violent time? Well, we have no real information to tell us that. Did We ecosystems? Did they learn from one another? It's pretty complicated. We see more than one people here during the contact period when Europeans and others start coming here. And we know how complex that got in historic times, and still remains to this day. So it's a real interesting time. Things are going on here. We don't have a full grip on it, but we know things are changing. And it changes even more when we get into what we call the Woodland period. starting about 3,000 years ago and right up to the time of European contact. And what we see here is during this time period is a switch to crop cultivation, still doing, that foraging because there's so much food in Connecticut if you know how to get to it. But now we actually start seeing the planting of corn, beans, squash, tobacco, and other products. And we start now seeing the formulation of more sedentary village life. If you're going to plant, you've got to stick around. And of course, with the crop cultivation, it may allow for increased populations. We also see in this time period clay ceramics coming in. And it's also this time period we see the bow and arrow diffused into Connecticut. Now, these other stone points we've showed you, they were placed at the end of spears, probably thrown with an atlatl or a spear thrower. It's not until 1,500 years ago that we start seeing a smaller triangular point, stone point, that is indicative of the end of an arrow. So the bow and arrow is, the great antiquity of 12,000 years. It's only in the last 1,500 years or so that the bow and arrow is here. And the sites we find associated with the woodland many times are located on good farmland where they can grow certain crops. The early woodland period is really kind of a neat one. Things are happening here, but also we seem to be introduced to another social system. And there's certainly an effort to maintain a stratified social system at this point. But we see kind of declining rituals. There are some still, cremation burials of this time period, but there seems to be a changing economy. There's a reduction in populations. The sites are less and they're smaller. And we do know, from climatic studies that this climate gets around 3,000 years ago, gets quite cooler here. And it couldn't have an effect on some of the resources that are here. But what also happens is we get introduced to other people also at this time period. The Ohio Adena mound builders. Now, you may know of the mound builders out west in the Ohio River Valley, in the Mississippian River Valley. We have no mounds in Connecticut. They did not build mounds here. There's no Adena or Mississippian mound building presence here, but there are Adena artifacts here, which suggest a trade network from the Ohio Valley into Connecticut. We have copper beads and boat stones that I showed you in that last slide. And there seems to be a differential treatment within some of the same sites going on. We have Adena burials, not in mounds, but earthen burials that have been located in Connecticut along the coast and along the Connecticut River Valley. So who were these people? Were they mercenaries coming in as, warriors, armies? Were they traders trying to trade with our Connecticut Native American population? Were they missionaries? Were they coming in with a new religious viewpoint, preaching among Connecticut Native Americans? Fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we're not isolated, and Connecticut wasn't isolated. It's tied into this huge network of Native America, and it's interacting with that. And we see that in Connecticut in archaeology here. Clay ceramics come in. The Vignette 1 is the earliest we see during the early woodland period. These are kind of clay pots, wide mouth. They have pointed bottoms. You can see here with my cursor. What that does is, they probably dug a hole in the ground, wedged the pot into that conical hole, and then built a fire around it. But it's coiling method, kind of coil hot dog shapes that are just kind of wound and wound around and cord and pressed for design. Some say these may have originated in the Great Lakes area and gets here around 3,000 or so years ago. So what we see is more and more development of ceramic styles and so forth. And we come to what we call the late woodland period. This is where we really see an introduction of maize horticulture. Now where whole villages have horticultural fields associated with them. We know that they were using, we have a lot of information now because of of postmortems that I'll talk about in a moment. Oval pole-framed wigwams were used. 1 or 2 families shared a dwelling. But now there's a more asceticism here. There's village settlements where people are staying year-round. The evidence we have from burials of that time period talk about flexed fetal inhumations. Very little, no funerary objects. Things are probably pretty well here. And there's not a heightened ceremonialism that we'll see later during the contact period when there's a lot of cultural stress coming in. I want to point out one archaeological site in the Connecticut River Valley in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, the Morgan site, because this is probably the largest agricultural village in Connecticut 1,000 years ago. This site was excavated in the 1980s by Dr. Lucianne Lavin and David Cook. And it has such a diversity of ceramic styles with a great influence evidently coming in from New York State. But it also has, the site itself has great organic preservation. So archaeologically, we get a lot of animal bones, and we recovered large quantities of charred maize. This really gives us an insight into horticulture and what was going on here. It's an extremely important site. And when we look at that development of maize, understand that, maize is a tropical plant. Corn is a tropical plant. We start seeing it in the archaeological record being domesticated in Mexico 8,000-9,000 years ago. But Native American farmers worked their way and, experimented with this plant through up into the Americas, up into the, to the Southeast, and eventually developing hardier and hardier breeds of this corn that can grow in a place like Connecticut that has a short growing season. And so what ends up happening is that, what we enjoy is really nothing more, if you want to say, than 8,000 years of Native American breeding and harvesting of this plant. That allows not only for larger villages and populations later on, but certainly what we enjoy today is all led down through that. By the way, Native Americans gave us corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, all New World plants. Being Italian, I like to think that Italian marinara sauce has been around forever in Italy. And actually, it's a post-Columbus phenomena in my country, my ancestors' country. Native Americans gave us that. And the Connecticut Native Americans were also working, harvesting, and breeding corn, beans, and squash in this area. And we see it at the Morgan site and others like it. So what's happening at this late Woodland period is social organization is becoming a bit more complex. We're now starting to see what we call tribal political organizations. These were egalitarian social organizations where basically everyone was equal, but there were nominal leaders, headmen, if you will, chiefs, if you will, sachems, as are known in New England, that help organize the groups or politically, economically, spiritually. And life is centered around the village. And what we want to know archaeologically is, we want to ask questions about that development. How are houses arranged in the village? Was there population increases? Are the villages open? That is to say, are they just open, or are they palisaded and fortified? Actually, during the late Woodland period, they're open. Must have been pretty peaceful times. But during the contact period, when Europeans get here and the cultural tensions now develop in the 17th century, we find these villages now become fortified. They become surrounded by a palisade. In time of conflict, you protect yourself. When times are peaceful, you could be open. And was each village a separate political unit? By the time the Europeans got here, as they came up the Connecticut River, every village they saw was a tribe. The Scantics and the Wampanoags, not the Wampanoags, but the Wyangunks and the Metabassets and so forth. As they came up the Connecticut River, everyone was a tribe. They were villages, but they were all, I'm sure, under certain political leadership. They were all related, and they were all part of their confederacies. But we gave tribes names to tribes. It's more of a European political understanding. What was really going on here is very complex and doesn't always fit, political organizations developed by Europeans. And there certainly was cultural diversity here that we see. So one of the questions archaeologists are, how important was horticulture? Some called it a non-event along the coast where there was so much resource, food, that, growing corn and maize could be just a side venture, a supplement to the diet. But when we look in the interior, when we look at sites like the Morgan site and others in the Connecticut River Valley, clearly corn is a very big part of the economy here in the riverine areas. It also can have to do with not only the good fertile soils that allow for the growing that we still grow and farm today, but also now what can happen is, and what we see is local food sources being storage for a later time period, storage from the harvest into the winter. So you can maintain sedentary year-round occupations. So when we ask questions about the village and the houses, the distribution of the houses, how they faced each other, how many were, but this is the houses we're talking about, wigwams, wooden structures covered by furs and mats and bark that were around. The interior had, cots for sleeping and places to hang your clothes and your tools and a central fireplace with a smoke hole on top. And they made these by taking frames of, saplings, wood, trees that you could bend and modify, turn it into a frame and cover it over with those bark mats and furs. I point this out because you see where every one of those poles goes into the ground, is secured into the ground with the frame of the wigwam? Well, it's wood. It rots. It decays. It decomposes. When it does, follow my cursor, it leaves a stain in the soil. And archaeologists can now take those stains and the pattern of those stains and understand the totality, if you will, the wigwam, the house. Just think about that. If we excavate an area large enough, can we count the number of houses? Do we estimate the size of the village or the camp? If we can excavate inside the house, how many people lived in that house? How many people, if we excavate outside the house, is this a large village, a camp? What does it tell us about the activities? How many people lived in the house? What does that tell us about their families? Do we find one house that maybe is a sweat lodge, a little different than the others? Think of the multiple buildings we have in our culture, from houses to, houses of worship, places for merchants, and so forth. We get that diversity, we get that understanding, and we can understand better how they organize themselves at that time period. And those storage ones I've told you about, this is what they look like archaeologically. This is a storage feature in the ground. This is the horizontal. You see the storage feature coming out. This is vertical going in the ground. This is a bowl shape where maize, corn, in some cases even meat products were put down here. We find that were being stored. The ground kept it cooler in the winter, in the summer, and warmer in the winter. And look at this. Archaeologically, we could actually see the lining of the storage pit. It was matted and purposely made. It's a kind of an ancient refrigerator is what it is, how we use our refrigerators using the earth. But this teaches us so much about the economy and the sedentism of the people involved. So when we look at the late woodland social system, there's evidence for egalitarianism with nominal leaders. There's increased trade networks. We now remember like that back in the Paleo period, we're starting to see more and more exotic or different kind of lithics coming in at that time. Trade networks are getting very complex. We see population increases and maybe the development of historical political units we call the tribes today. and certainly the development, most likely, of tribal homelands, territories that are associated with it. And certainly it looks like possibly life is centered around village, the village-oriented social system. It all changes with the contact period that starts 400 years ago, with the introduction now of Europeans on the landscape. It starts with exploration and then settlement. Settlement starts, we all know, in this area in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. But that's really late. Exploration actually starts 100 years earlier. We know that Verrazano, a good Italian flying under a French flag, was here by 1525, shortly after Columbus made contact in the Caribbean area. And at first my point being is, by the time 1620 comes along, our Native Americans have had contact with Europeans for over 100 years. And many Native Americans from this area were kidnapped by European explorers and brought to Europe. And some that were able to get back to Connecticut spoke fluent English. So the Puritans are really late in this story. The trading occurs that sometimes could benefit both sides, but it led to social disruption because of the fact that not only were, beads and axes and pots and furs being traded, but old world diseases were now introduced to a people that never had any exposure to these diseases or any immunity. And so what we see is, how do you want to say, you want to say the Holocaust of population decrease. 90% of villages are decimated because of smallpox and measles and tuberculosis. It's estimated by the time the Pilgrims got here in 1620, there had maybe been 3 major epidemics that inflicted, old world epidemics that inflicted themselves horrifically on native populations here. So Europeans were already looking at a decimated population by the time that would have been here during the late Woodland period. And we identify these sites basically by the presence of European trade goods and radiocarbon dates of the period. So what starts then is now a new people here, and with it, contact, coexistence for a while through the 17th century, resistance through the 17th and into the 18th century, but eventually dispossession. Many natives that survive just leave the area, but many stay and survive and can trace, people today trace their descendants to that survival. It's an extraordinary story. And I consider the survival of Native Americans to be one of the most amazing human survival stories of all time. How they survived is just incredible, considering all that was done to eliminate them, physically and culturally. So it's a time period of intense coexistence, resistance, and survival. In the 17th century, there's a Pequot War of 1636, 1637, King Philip's War in 1676, all with efforts of ridding native population, ridding the English from this side, from this countryside. So what we see at this time period, is reflected in the archaeological record, is a political power balance in the 17th century of Native Americans, English, and Dutch. And in the 17th century, all 3 were powerful. Don't think, once we landed here in Plymouth that, we took over. Our populations increased due to the great migrations in the 1630s, so much so, and the decimation of native diseases to diseases strikes the balance and changes it. But Native Americans right through the 17th century were very powerful here. The Dutch too. At the beginning of the 17th century, it's all Native American. By the end of the 17th century, the English have reinvented themselves in New England and are the most powerful, with the Dutch holding on to the New Netherlands as much as they could with this changing power balance. But what a dynamic time, a time of change. We find trade goods through that time that survive in the archaeological record. We find pottery of that time that now has changed. Necks, the neck forms, and we see this in the late Woodland too, where now the pot is hung over the fire and more globular rounded. But look at these constellations, look at these design motifs that are now put onto the pot. This is what we call shantok ware and is associated with the Mohegan tribe. But what becomes important here is these motifs and designs are designs as communication. They express shared ideas, and they are probably handed down mother to daughter. So there's a trail of matrilineal descent going on here that tell the story of the tribes through these. And at least one archaeologist maintains that these designs show a resistance to colonization that was happening to the native population here in the 17th century. The artifacts help tell the story of the people at the Brian D. Jones site, as well as these other sites, and actually do today in terms of our sites. So the contact social organization is a continued or, kind of a revitalized ritualism. Things are bad. People are dying. And there's a heightened, anytime, we say that times are bad, people go to church. And so there's a heightened ritual going on to try to bring back maybe the old ways, restore stability to the trauma that's now occurring. And I might tell you there's also a very slow acculturation of European ideology. Native Americans were very quick to take on our technology. They wanted nails and axes, steel axes and iron axes rather, and pots and so forth. But they were very slow to take on our ideology, our belief systems, our mores, our values. They had their own. And so it's been suggested that the slow acculturation of ideology is probably a reflection of resistance, holding on in a response to the disastrous impact of Europeans here. One thing to take technology, but the ideas that culture provides, that comes along a little slower, more resistance. And so when we look at the archaeology of this time period, my colleague Kevin McBride at the Department of Anthropology at UCONN, through a grant from the National Park Service, American Battlefield, has defined the Pequot War in ways that we have never seen it before. Before this, we've had oral tradition and documents, but very little archaeology. Now we're recovering artifacts from the battlefields themselves that have given us a new impression of what was happening out there, new interpretations, and the pattern of where these are distributed along the landscape help us understand more what was going on, the impact of native cultures, and how they resisted as long as they could. And the last thing I want to point out is the significance of stone monuments. This has become really important in the last decade or so in America, in Connecticut archaeology and New England archaeology at whole. And I save it to the end because, I'm unsure as to when this becomes a cultural practice, whether it goes back thousands of years to the Archaic period, as some have suggested, or whether it's a post-contact phenomena. We do know that post-contact Native Americans were very good stone masons. When you look at, the Pequots, the Nipmunks, the Narragansetts, they were very acute with using stone. In fact, many European farmers hired them to build stone walls and other stone foundations and other factors, stone houses and what have you. So, the question is whether this use of stone goes back thousands of years and is part of the native repertoire, or whether this comes on later or not. but it is important because there is a concept now of ceremonial stone landscapes that are out there, sometimes in terms of ceremonial heaps, sometimes patterns that are indicative of astronomical alignments, and maybe others that are for ritual purposes. The conundrum is that in historic times, we have European American agrarian stone usage, clearing stones from fields and building foundations and stone walls that we wax poetic about in Connecticut, in New England. So we have two different people from two different cultures using stone, sometimes in similar and dissimilar ways, but for different purposes. So the real challenge we now have in archaeology is to differentiate, and not only to differentiate, but to interpret and understand. And this comes from oral traditions within the native peoples themselves, along with archaeological methods of documentation. So this is a kind of an interesting phase. There's more to learn about this. But we all know that, certainly Native Americans and European Americans were utilizing stone. And so understanding this is going to be really important as we go to the future. And I also would be remiss to acknowledge that Native American tribes are extant here in the state of Connecticut. They are still here. And that's an extraordinary story, as I mentioned. The continuity from the Brian Jones site right down 12,500 years ago is fully felt here to this day. We have 5 recognized tribes. Now, 2 of them you're most familiar with, the Mashantucket Pequot and the Mohegan Nation, tribal nation, because they have federal recognition with our federal government. But the Eastern Pequot, the Golden Hill Pagusset, and the Scotticook tribal nation all have recognized at the state levels and interact with the archaeological community. Most of us interact with them through where we have what's called the Native American Heritage Advisory Council, which advises tribal members from each of the tribes, advise the state archaeologist and the State Historic Preservation Office on aspects of sacred sites and burials. But also many of these tribes have their own archaeologists or have worked with archaeologists to help define their past within their reservation areas. So, when I first started talking about Native Americans in Connecticut back in the, in the 80s, in the 70s and 1980s, people would come to me and say, "We have Indians in Connecticut?" Well, nobody asks that question anymore. But what's important to note is that what's happened is not only the awareness of the Native American presence here, but also that archaeologists have worked more and more with them. When we started back in those 70s and 80s, Native Americans and archaeologists rarely ever talked to each other, ever tried to understand each other. And today, we've come 180 degrees and like to think so. There's consultation now when we work with the Connecticut tribes and tribes throughout New England and in the country. And so there's open dialogue so that we can learn from each other, learn from their oral traditions when they can share them, and learn from the archaeological record when we can understand it better. It's a new world, and it's a world for the better. And it's a great time to be an archaeologist in the state of Connecticut. And I'm going to leave you with this last slide. And this is from the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. And hopefully, if you haven't been there, hopefully you've been there. If you haven't been, please get down there. It's a wonderful exhibit, museum. But this one exhibit and this one photograph from the exhibit really hits me. And that is, you have a young man teaching his son how to hunt in the woodland. This is school. This is the learning, the passing on of culture. And when you look at this scene as an archaeologist, maybe the only thing that's going to survive, follow my cursor, is the stone tip to that point, because stone is durable. It lasts in the soil. The bow, the wood, even the remains of the people themselves will be gone. But that stone preserves. the hard thing, the challenge for archaeologists, how do we go from that stone point to understanding the totality of a people's life? That's the challenge. And we've made mistakes, but hopefully future archaeologists, and I'm so inspired by the young kids that are coming up today, will have an even better grip and understanding, working with Native peoples today, of that past. Hey, thanks, guys. I'm going to close with that.
All right.
And I'm
Thank you
going to
very
stop
much,
sharing
Nick.
the screen.
And I know we have time for a couple of questions.
Sure. Yeah.
The first one is, did pre-European cultures use fermentation processes, or was this a European import?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did they make wine and beer? Is that what you're asking? I don't know the answer to that, because I don't know that we have the archaeological evidence for something like that. They probably did to a certain extent, because they obviously had very complicated cooking processes and storing processes. And there could have been a time when they started to ferment things. But I really, from the archaeological record, that's a real difficult thing to find, unless we had samples of some kind of substance that we could test. But I like that question, and I think I'm gonna consult with my other colleagues on this, and if we could find a consensus on this, we're happy to share on the next webinar.
Okay.
But, that's a great question.
All right. The next question is, what is the largest early Native American settlement found in Connecticut so far? This guest assumes we don't have evidence of large cities like what you see out west.
So, the largest site is the one I referred to, the Morgan site. It dates to 1,000 years ago, but this covered acres and acres and acres of land. We haven't even determined the extent of this within the Connecticut River floodplain. It's huge, and hundreds of people were occupied at that site. By the time we get to the contact period, we're already looking at reduced populations. So the sites may not be as large, even though we have villages here. They may not have been as large as the Morgan site, and it's still one of my favorites, and probably tells us that there were significant populations here. We were taught that Europeans came here to a wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
Forget about it. This wasn't a wilderness. People lived here, and they used the land, and they modified the land. If it wasn't for Native Americans being here, we would never have gotten a foothold on this continent in the 17th century, because everywhere we settled down, from Boston, New York, Newark, Indians, Native Americans had already had large villages, some of which had been decimated because of the diseases, or they had been displaced. This wasn't a wilderness. There were probably 750,000 people in New England before Europeans got here, maybe even higher than that. So
Okay.
hard to compare from out west. And it's
Okay.
hard to compare it to historic times, because we're always looking at great changes.
Okay. And then we have a question about the Brian Jones site and the area. So the area in Avon would have been deglaciated already. So would the landscape have been wooded with conifers like Canada is today, or more steppe tundra like with grasses and shrubs?
Yeah, probably more steppe tundra. It's hard, but when you look at the Brian Jones site and some of the botanicals that are coming there, some of them are surprisingly, more modern that we recognize and have more of a diversity than we see. But Connecticut's ice-free about, as I mentioned, 15,000 years ago. So what happens after that? It takes a while. It's a barren landscape for it to fill in. And once the grasses come in, of course, the animals that feed off those grasses come in, and and so forth. So it's a snowballing, and of course, people follow those animals and grasses. So, but don't think it was like the environment you see when you look out the window. That's for sure.
Okay.
Our May 9th webinar this year is going to be on the macrobotanicals of the Paleo period in general. So we're going to be talking a lot about that on May 9th. So that's going to be with another speaker. So if anybody's interested in that, make sure you put that on your schedule to be with us on May 9th for that event, for that webinar.
Fantastic. All right. That, I know that we're out of time.
There's one, someone put up about an archaeological dig at
Oh.
Quonset Lake, and I just want to respond to that real
Sure,
quick.
go ahead.
That individual should probably contact the Office of State Archaeology about information of that. We're very familiar with that site, and we're very familiar with the sites in that area. It was definitely a Native American burial ground, probably associated with the Nipmuc tribes, but it's a very sensitive and a very important area. If you have ties and you want more information, you should contact a state archaeologist for that. It's a very important area and a very sacred area.
And the question was about the south end of Quonset Lake, in Woodstock, Connecticut.
Right.
There was a site, and how do you
That's
find out
right.
more information about it? So
That's right.
fantastic. Thank you, Nick. All right. I know that we are out of time. This has been delightful. Our audience would let you tell stories and give us the history and the archaeology for hours, Nick. Hours and hours. So thank you for your time today.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you, and
thank
thank you all. I hope it was useful to your seminar. You guys do a great job.
Wonderful.
Appreciate
All right,
it.
everyone. Have a good
All right,
night.
Take care. Good night, everybody.